And we are live, so hello everyone. We are coming in for our final video for the month of July, given that today is July 31st. And going into a little bit of thought this past week, I've come to the conclusion that I want to go ahead here and take a look at a certain aspect of the Second World War, considering the factor that we are coming up in August here on the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II when Japan officially surrendered to the Allied nations. And something that I think we could definitely take a look at here. It's going to be a couple videos that would come out during the process of this is I want to take a look at how Japan came to the mindset it was in going into the Second World War. We all know very well the history of Japan's atrocities during the Second World War, the innumerous number of war crimes and brutal tactics used by the Japanese during that war are absolutely appalling in many regards. Not to say that other nations did not do stuff that was of equal measure to human life, but in terms of what the Japanese did, some of it was right on par, if not worse, in certain ways than some of the stuff that the Nazi Germans were actually committing in Europe. That's not to say that, trying to whitewash the Holocaust or anything, because that in its own is a whole nother topic of debate. And as much as Japan did do these atrocities, they weren't committing large scale genocide like the Nazis were. But in terms of how Japan got to that point, I want to go ahead here and do a little bit of a couple videos going into the next month and a half, maybe, because we're not going to do these all back to back. We'll try to do breaks in between with other topics from here and again. But something I want to take a look at is how Japan got to the mindset that it was in the First World War. Because if you are a student of history, many of you will probably know very well that Japan, not even 100 years before the Second World War, had become a fully modernized and industrialized nation. And within less than 100 years, it went from being a backwards feudal society to a fully industrialized, modernized nation that was a dominant regional power, a burgeoning world power, and it was able to get quite a bit done prior to the outbreak of the Second World War, which is quite remarkable for that time. So, going into that discussion, the first video that we're going to cover here regarding the long road to Japanese involvement in the Second World War is we're going to take a look of the first event of what could be called our stepping stones, and that would be the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Now, what the Meiji Restoration is it marks the definitive point at which Japan goes from being a backwards feudal society in an age of industrialized nations to becoming one of the most rapidly industrialized and modern nations in the world. Japan was able to fully and modernize within less than 30 years. And that is quite remarkable when you consider that other nations in the West, such as Great Britain and France and even the United States, had taken well over 100 years to fully industrialize themselves. And Japan was able to accomplish it in less than 30, very rapidly, which was quite a remarkable feat that they've managed to take under their belt during their long history of, contests with other nations. And going into that whole discussion, it is the Meiji Restoration that it marks the first stepping stone toward the road to World War II, because first of all, Japan has to industrialize, it has to modernize. But in order to do that, it's got to get on a modern footing, and that is what the Meiji Restoration does. We are following videos that we will more or less focus on certain aspects, a lot of military maneuvers that Japan's going to end up doing. Most notably, we'll have to take a look at the first Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese involvement in the First World War, and of course, Japanese militarism during the 1920s and 1930s. All these are stepping stones to the path that Japan will end up taking. But for the purpose of today, we are going to take a look at the first step, and that is the Meiji Restoration, or otherwise we could call it the birth of a modern Japan. This is the birth of the modern Japanese nation. So, going into this topic, now, this did not happen officially until 1868, but the Meiji Restoration was an event years and decades in the making prior. There were several events that ended up leading to this. A general summary of what it was, just to start out with, was the Meiji Restoration of 1868 would see the overthrow of the long ruling Tokugawa Shogunate that had ruled Japan for over 260 years at this point. It would restore power to the emperor, the monarch of Japan, and as a consequence, Japan would begin to fully westernize and modernize. It would become the first Asian nation to do so. China had kind of attempted to do this, but had largely kind of failed due to its numerous conflicts with the European powers and its internal strife. Now, the Meiji Restoration would have three primary causes that are eventually going to come together and accomplish this birth of a new modern Japan. And the three causes that would eventually lead to the events of that restoration were the Bakuan system, a foreign threat from foreign nations, and the rise of imperial loyalism within Japan itself. So, all three of these factors are going to come together. So we're going to take a look here at each of these three factors as we go through this here, and then we will come back and kind of tie them all together and see what eventually kind of comes about in 1868 that brings an end to the feudal society that was Japan under the Tokugawa period. So the first of the factors was the Bakuan system. And the Bakuhan system was the political order that had been imposed in Japan by the Tokugawa Shogunate after 1600 when the Tokugawa really came to power. Now the Tokugawa clan was the ruling clan of Japan. They kind of held most of the political power on the Japanese archipelago, even superseding the emperor himself. They held the reins of Japan and could do pretty much whatever they wanted with the country. And they had ruled Japan in this capacity largely since their victories over several other clans in 1600. Now, the Tokugawa family controlled roughly 30% of all of the Japanese archipelago, while the remaining land, now you might think, well, if it's only 30%, how are they in the rule? Well, consider this. Although the Tokugawa controlled 30% on their own, you might not think that's much, the remaining 70% of Japan is divided up between 270 daimyos, which is they were hereditary rulers of these different, basically like little mini states within Japan. The daimyos would control their own little mini states. They were like almost like lords, and they would control these own little mini states in the rest of Japan. But the Tokugawa family alone ruled 30% of the island, not divided between a bunch of other daimyos, which is quite impressive. The daimyo lands, or little states, they were often called Hans, and the Tokugawa government was known as the bakufu. So the bakuhan system is basically a combination of these two words. So it is a combination of the daimyo lands, the Hans, and the Tokugawa government under the Tokugawa shogunate, which is the bakufu. Now, the Tokugawa would control the daimyos and keep them in line from 1600 throughout the duration of most of their rule. But each daimyo would largely rule their han as they please, like almost like mini countries. Think of it as Japan at this time during the Tokugawa shogunate is kind of acting as sort of a federation of states where they have a general overhead big boss, but each of the little states are largely free to govern themselves as they please. This, unless you step massively out of line and tick the guy off on the high throne. Well, in this case, in terms of whoever's in power in the Tokugawa family. Now, despite rigorously keeping the daimyos in line in the 17th century, by the 18th century, the bakufu system was starting to have problems due to institutional inertia. It wasn't really modernizing, it wasn't really reforming, it wasn't really changing. And while the system may have worked very well in the 1600s, it wasn't going to work real well going into the 1700s and the 1800s. And Japan, during this time of the Tokugawa shogunate, also known as the Edo period, it would experience an age of peace and economic growth. Now, the Tokugawa, of course, we will come back to this point, but they isolated Japan for about roughly 250 years, where they had almost no contact with any foreign nations. Foreign traders were not allowed to stop in Japan and trade. Japanese nationals were not allowed very often to leave the country, and it kind of isolated Japan as this almost like a pariah state in Far East Asia that was far removed from the influence of most of the major European powers. The cities and population in Japan during the Edo period would grow. Literacy, scholarship, and urban culture would also flourish under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. The Bakuan system would thus kind of be a good thing for Japan during the first 2 centuries of its rule, but as we mentioned, by the 18th century, it is starting to experience some problems, and at the turn of that century going into the 19th, it is going to become a system that is going to be increasingly challenged by those who want change, and it is increasingly becoming a system that is outdated. Which brings us to the biggest contributor to the death of the Kufu or the Bakuhan system, and that is the foreign threat of foreign nations, mostly European powers in the West. Now, that comes us back to our central point here. Since the 1630s, Japan had largely been cut off from international affairs. The Tokugawa restricted contact with all foreign nations, as we stated before. They didn't really allow Japanese to go out to other countries. They didn't allow too often traders or even missionaries to come into Japan. And part of this was because the Tokugawa feared that rebellious daimyos might gain support from outside foreign nations, and then these nations would go and support the daimyos in a rebellion against the shogunate. Mostly at the time, they feared nations such neighboring Korea and China as being the two primary nations that might back a daimyo led rebellion. Unfortunately for the shoguns, they kind of did not part. This was their initial fear back in the 1630s. They rapidly came to realize that the real threat wasn't really from Korea or China. It was coming from the far west. It was coming from Europe. Now, Japan's distance from Europe and its relative technological evenness at the time of the implication of this foreign isolation made Japan possible to enforce an isolation for roughly 200 years. It was at the time, Japan was pretty even in terms of technology. They weren't really far behind the Europeans, so it made a self imposed isolation actually quite attainable at the time for the Tokugawa to actually institute on the archipelago. That would change about 200 years later, mostly by the Industrial Revolution. In the late 18th century, Europe underwent the Industrial Revolution, which would continue into the 19th century. And as part of this revolution, everything was getting changed and modernized with new technology, including ships, who are now starting to actually exhibit the benefits of industrial power. European ships with industrial age weapons were beginning to sail into Japanese waters by the turn of the 19th century and demanding that Japan open itself to foreign trade. The Tokugawa at this time refused to do so, still wishing that that they could implement some sort of a foreign isolation to maintain their rule. By 1839, however, events in China had largely started to worry many of the people in Japan who still heard about what was going on with their neighbors. In 1839, Japan had managed to fully colonize India and Asia and had even won the subsequent Opium War with neighboring Qing China. And the Japanese in Japan started to see that if the Tokugawa refused to modernize, it could possibly very well be a bad thing going forward for Japan because they started to see what was going on in China. And this starts to scare many, including most of the daimyos who made efforts to start acquiring European weapons in order to have some sort of a modernization effort going on. In 1853, a squadron of American warships would be led by Commodore Matthew Perry, arriving in Japan and demanding that Japan open itself up to trade under the threat that they had these big imposing modern warships that Japan is still using sailcraft. That was a little bit of a blackmail on the Americans' part. This was the first contact that the Americans really had massively with Japan, and this definitely kind of signaled a you're either going to give us the agreement that we want or we're not afraid to actually show you just how technologically advanced that we are compared to you. Now, as a result of this, the Tokugawa would make concessions to the Americans, and they officially would open up ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to trade in 1854, just a year later. So the opening of Japan to foreign trade officially comes because of American intervention. Americans come in 1853, and just a year later, Japan opened itself up to American trade. As a consequence, they would have to make similar agreements with other Western nations who are going to use similar tactics now that the US has gotten open trade with Japan, which would soon be followed with agreements with nations like Britain, Russia, and the Netherlands, who had presence out in the Pacific and Asia in a whole. The signing of these trade treaties would make many in Japan see the Tokugawa as weak and see them as unable to defend Japan against the foreign powers. Many of the treaties that were signed by the Tokugawa different with the different Western nations were favorable for the Westerners. They were not favorable for Japanese trade. They put massive tariffs on. They put what would happen here was they would put massive tariffs on one end of it, but not on the other. So what would end up happening was the United States would put tariffs on Japanese goods to discourage their citizens from buying Japanese goods. But Japan, in response, would keep relatively low tariff rates on goods coming from the United States into their country, which made the flow of cheap foreign goods quite full in Japan, which hurt the Japanese economy immensely. And at the same time, the daimyos and other Japanese critics of Western intervention, they do want to modernize Japan, but they don't want to become a colony. And you might say, well, why would they think this? Look at what was going on just next door in China. China had opened itself fully to Western trade, and look at what got them. They had been invaded, conquered, had concessions to the Western powers. They had fought 3 wars recently just against Britain and France over opium, over heroin, and lost, and they had to deal massive concessions to the Western powers. So there is quite a few Japanese daimyos who are correctly seeing what's going on in China, and they're saying the Tokugawa are heeding the lessons that we're seeing next door. Yes, you're getting these trade agreements with these Western nations, but the trade is more benefiting them than it is us. It's hurting our economy. At the same time, how can we trust their word? Because look at what they're doing right next door in China. They are not respecting the agreements that were laid, and they're not afraid to use force when something goes awry that they don't like. So, how can we trust that these Western nations are not going to come into Japan, invade us, and make us a colony? And that is the main worry going into the 1850s and 1860s of a lot of the native daimyos worrying about the Tokugawa shogunate's ability to actually defend Japan against any Western influence that is trying to come across the water. So, which leads us into a third category that is going to really be another big contributor to the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate, and that is the rise of imperial loyalism, which is also going to be a factor that is going to persist in Japanese mindset throughout the next almost 100 years, going into World War II, most famously, when we have many Japanese who, absolutely think that the emperor is a god, and we know how that goes. So, despite the Japanese emperor having reigned throughout Japan's history, Japan's had an emperor almost from the time of its creation. I believe it's Emperor Jimmu, who is considered to be the very first Japanese emperor. I could be wrong on the name. But Japan had an emperor almost in its entirety of existence. It's had an emperor, and it's actually quite astonishing. They still have one today, he's just like a constitutional monarch. But despite the emperor having been present throughout most of Japanese history, they had only very rarely actually exercised any sort of political power. They weren't like the old kings and queens of medieval Europe. They had very rarely actually had significant political power in their own hands. They were more just kind of a figurehead. Now, in ancient times, the emperor's court was often the ruling body of the nation, and the emperor's court had ruled in ancient times, but later eras would see families like the Minamoto and most famously the Tokugawa end up kind of taking over the rule of the country, with the emperor just kind of acting as like a rubber stamp on anything that they wanted to do. In 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu had the emperor appoint him as shogun, which had allowed him to establish the bakufu system. Now, despite the real political power lying with the shogunate and the Tokugawa clan, the Tokugawa was still very careful to maintain the prestige of the imperial family. They knew that the emperor was well beloved. The imperial family was a beloved institution of the Japanese people. To just outright go against it would be an absolute detriment to them, and they still needed to have some kind of the air of legitimacy of rule in Japan. So maintaining the imperial family and maintaining the emperor's prestige would be vital to kind of rubber stamping the legitimacy of their rule. So they were very careful during those 260 years to maintain the prestige of the emperor and in order to aid their own legitimacy to their claim to rule Japan. Now, the spread of Neo Confucianism ideas that had come across from China into Japan in the 18th century would lead to a new source of influence for the imperial family that is going to rapidly change the mindset of many people within the Japanese population. it- what Neo Confucianism would end up kind of doing was it would emphasize qualities of loyalty and filial piety, and it would be attached to the long believed tales among the Japanese that the emperors were descended from gods, and that because of this, Japan was a divine land, and the emperor was sort of this divine being. And some daimyos began to believe, as a consequence of this new religion being mixed into Shinto beliefs, that Japan was superior to other countries due to the divine origin of the imperial family. And they believed that because of this, because the emperor was divine, that government by any warrior families like the Tokugawas under their shogunate were illegitimate, and that the emperor should be the one to rule the nation. And many of the thinkers and independent writers within Japan would come to believe in this as well. They would believe that because the imperial family was sort of the descendant of gods, and they had this sort of divinity to them, that they should be the ones in power, not this illegitimate, government set up by a warrior clan family that has no claim to divinity. And together, a movement began to form in Japan between independent writers and thinkers, and majority of the population that was opposed to the Tokugawa in their rule because they believed it was illegitimate, and opposed to the opening of Japan to the Western powers, believing that while we do want to modernize, we want to modernize on our terms, not become a colony of the Western powers and not adhere to whatever trade agreements they strictly make for us. And a common catchphrase at this time, or slogan at the time, by this movement would become the one of "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians," meaning the Westerners, would be a very common one that would come about at this time. And one final aspect that, if we want to consider maybe a fourth that could contribute to the Meiji Restoration, would be the regional and class backgrounds of the people involved. Now, during the Tokugawa Shogunate, the daimyos of Japan were divided into categories, two main categories based on their connection to the Tokugawa clan. Families who had been retainers and supporters of the Tokugawa before they had officially come to power in 1600 were known as Fudai daimyo. They were typically kept in much closer confidence with the Tokugawa clan. Families who were not retainers and had not been supporters of the Tokugawa shogunate before 1600, who had kind of opposed it in its rule, they were known as Hozama daimyo. They were opponents. Now, the Tozama daimyo were less trusted as a consequence by the Tokugawa clan, and they often had lands further away from Japan's political center, so they were kind of ostracized and kept on the outside of politics as much as possible. The anti-Tokugawa movements that would be critical in the Meiji Restoration mostly originated within the Tozama daimyo, those daimyo who had not supported the Tokugawa prior to 1600 and were kind of kept out of majority of Japanese politics. This is where most of that anti-Tokugawa movement would come from. And just to display, I mean, we don't have a whole lot of images for this, unfortunately, because I mean, we're talking more about political movement here. But here we have like a poster of from the 1860s, but depicts like a Japanese sumo wrestler getting rid of the barbarians, the Westerners out of Japan, simulating what they thought should happen, that we want to modernize, but these guys are going to run everything if we just let them come into the country and trade at their and agree to everything on their terms, which is something they definitely did not want. So that brings us to about the time frame of the Meiji Restoration, and that is where things are going to start getting interesting. So the last decades of the Edo period are commonly called the Bakumatsu period. Baku meaning the bakufu system, and matsu meaning Japanese word for end. So the bakufu end period, as we could put it in those terms. So in 1858, this is shortly after Japan has started to open itself up to foreign trade. The Tokugawa would sign the Japan-U.S. Treaty of Amity and Commerce, and this was a very unequal treaty because, as I think, yeah, we had kind of mentioned this before, but what the treaty would ultimately see low tariffs on imported goods, and foreigners were also not subject to Japanese law. So any American visiting Japan that maybe broke a Japanese law, say they murdered somebody, they would not be held for trial in Japan. They would be sent back to the United States and held for trial and tried according to American law, not according to Japanese law, even though the crime had occurred in Japan and may have involved a Japanese citizen. That was not a very good treaty at all. And of course, the low tariffs meant that cheap foreign goods were plentifully available, which would wreck the Japanese economy, and the opening of ports increased the hostility of the Japanese people toward foreigners. At this time, an anti Tokugawa group known as the Shishi, yes, quite a catchy name, isn't it? The Shishi, or righteous warriors, as or roughly translates to, would begin carrying out violent attacks in order to oppose the opening of the Japanese archipelago to foreign trade. They did not want any part of the Western powers taking advantage and turning them into a colony. The Tokugawa Shogunate was not doing anything to stop that, so they were more than willing to use force to accomplish their goals. Since the Shishi were willing to use violence to obtain those goals, they would often perform these acts of violence in terms of targeting both foreigners and Japanese enemies who they viewed were supporters of the Tokugawa. So this was almost like an inside terrorist organization, pretty much, in everything but name, is what the Shishi was. In 1860, the Tokugawa would try to crack down on the Shishi in the Ansai Purge, which would end up arresting many of the Shishi members and even executed some. Unfortunately, this would come to a rapid end when one of the Tokugawa officials would end up being assassinated. In 1863, anti foreign activists from Choshu seized the imperial court in Kyoto. Emperor Komei, who was angered at the opening of Japan, he actually agreed with the anti Tokugawa um, movements that were going on throughout his country. He called for all barbarians to be expelled from Japan. And Satsuma, well, before we go to Satsuma, which Emperor Komei's declaration that he wanted all these barbarians expelled from Japan due to the imperial loyalty that's starting to foster within the Japanese people, there would be numerous attacks on foreigners as a result, including some made by the Shishi, who were now doing it officially with the backing of the emperor. In Satsuma, the murder of a foreign merchant would cause a British ship to end up bombarding Kagoshima. And in Chosu, foreign ships were bombarded by shore batteries before European ships would knock them out. So the Emperor Komei's proclamation of expelling the barbarians from Japan would end up going against what the Tokugawa shogunate was hoping to achieve, because it ended up really getting a lot of the Japanese public to actively oppose these foreigners from entering Japan and their influence. And in some cases, they would even end up murdering and firing on foreigners that were coming into Japan. Negotiation would eventually keep the bakufu from marching on Chosu after it ended up engaging these European ships, which was a common tactic of the Tokugawa back in the day. When one Han, the Chosu was a Han under one of the daimyos, and back in the day, the Tokugawa, if one of the daimyos ended up kind of getting rebellious, they would typically amass an army and invade that Han in order to bring it back under control. Only through negotiation was that averted. Activists in both the Satsuma and Chosu Hans realized that there would be no expelling the foreigners, that foreigners were here to stay in Japan, and that if they truly wanted to avoid having Japan become a colony of the European Western powers, it would need to create a new government that could effectively resist those Western influences. So the question was no longer just getting rid of the foreigners, as the emperor had proclaimed. They realized that wasn't going to work because the ruling government under the Tokugawa shogunate was open arms, welcoming these Western nations into Japan and their trade, and they realized that that was no longer going to work. That we need to oppose this Westernization more forcefully, and that is only going to happen if we get rid of the shogunate. We need a new government that can actively defend Japan against Western influence. So the Satsuma and Chosu would secretly ally in 1866, with Satsuma refusing to aid the Bakufu campaign that was launched by the Tokugawa against Chosu, and instead it supplied weapons to Chosu in order to help them fight the Tokugawa government. The Bakufu would actually end up failing to take Chosu, which would mark a significant event in terms that the Tokugawa are now no longer capable for the first time of enforcing their rule over a rebellious Han. In November of 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, 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 I should say Yoshinobu, as with you, he would offer to peacefully relinquish power to a newly ascended Emperor Meiji. He had just ascended the throne at age 16 after the death of Emperor Komi. And because of that, and because of the sentiment going on in the country, the new Tokugawa Yoshinobu correctly surmise that perhaps his shogunate days were over, that perhaps the ruling days of his clan kind of ruling Japan were over, and he, in November of 1867, offered to step down and relinquish that power purely to the emperor. However, Satsuma and Chosu had already been planning on a military campaign to forcefully rid the country of the Tokugawa shogunate and ending the Bakufu by force, which would end up happening for before Yoshinobu's plans could actually be implemented for a peaceful shutdown of the Tokugawa shogunate. So going along with that, I mean, these are really the only other images that we're going to have here, because, like I said, this is just not a topic I have a lot of images. So here is Tokugawa Yoshinobu. He ended up being the last shogun of Japan, of the Tokugawa clan, to rule over Japan. He stepped down in 1868. And he lived till 1913. After he stepped down, he kind of just retired from public life largely. And then here we have the new emperor who would end up being the namesake of the Meiji Restoration under Emperor Meiji. And this is Emperor Meiji. This is a later picture of him. He was very youthful. Like I said, he was only 16 at the time of this restoration, but this is like 1872 or 1873, so just a couple years after. He's in his 20s. And this would be him. He would rule until 1912, overseeing most of the modernization of Japan, and he's going to be a recurring figure that we're going to hear about going into the next two videos that we'll have on this, path to World War II in terms of the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. He is the emperor throughout most of this. And during his reign, Japan is really seeing a new birth on the world stage. And here is a depiction of his coronation in Kyoto back in 1868 when he was only 16 years old. So in January of 1868, the anti-Tokugawa elements in Japan would officially start their military plan to get rid of the Tokugawa shogunate by seizing the imperial palace in Kyoto. They would issue an edict restoring the rule of the emperor, recognizing Emperor Meiji as the leader of Japan and as the ruler of Japan. This would lead to a civil war in Japan that would be known as the Boshin War between supporters of the imperial court under Emperor Meiji and those of the Bakufu under the Tokugawa clan. The Bakufu forces would end up being finally defeated in a final battle at the Battle of Toba Fushimi, and the imperial army would subsequently surround Edo, which is modern day Tokyo, which was kind of the last major holdout in the majority of Japan for the Bakufu forces, but the city would surrender to the imperial court forces after a peaceful negotiation. Resistance would continue in northern Japan, but by June of 1869, the remaining Bakufu forces on the island of Hokkaido would eventually surrender to the imperial court. So Tokugawa rule in 1868 was relatively ended rather quickly, mostly because the Tokugawa had come to realize their time was probably at an end, and they were already planning the current Tokugawa Yoshinobu was already planning on variously stepping down, but it was kind of hastened, and the Tokugawa kind of wanted to do it on their terms, and that kind of got robbed from them by this military uprising that ended up happening. Tokugawa rule had officially lasted 268 years in Japan, and it came to an end in 1868 with the Meiji Restoration. It was a relatively bloodlessness of the Meiji Restoration that would allow Japan to quickly modernize. It wasn't like while it was a short civil war with Boshin War, it wasn't relatively bloody. Take into account of, during the Meiji Restoration, during the Boshin War, only around 8,000 Japanese had been killed. In contrast to another conflict that had happened around this same time, just a couple years before, there had been the American Civil War, in which well over 800,000 had ended up dying in that Civil War, and had crippled the United States for a little while afterward as it was rebuilding the nation after being torn apart and killing themselves for 4 years, as we unfortunately did. And in Japan, it was only about 8,000. Clearly, and I think in a way that spoke to the want of the Japanese people to really modernize, to actually fall under the rule of the emperor and not under the rule of the Tokugawa anymore. And I think that could have been a contributor. And because of the relative bloodlessness of the Meiji Restoration, it meant that Japan would have a relatively very stable start for this period of modernization and reform to Japanese society that would ensue afterwards. And we will go more into the industrialization with the next episode a little bit. We'll have to give that a little bit more in the background. But with the completion in 1868 of the emperor now as the official head of state of Japan, and the emperor for the first time in a long time holding most of the political power within the nation, Japan is officially proclaimed to be the Empire of Japan in 1868. The Tokugawa Shogunate is done, and Japan is now on a stable foundation to start pursuing industrialization and modernization. And like we have mentioned, and we'll go into as we go into when we do the video on the first Sino-Japanese War, Japan is going to accomplish that industrialization and modernization relatively quickly for a nation that had just was relatively late to the game, and it's going to accomplish it in less than 30 years. So it's quite the accomplishment. But by 1868, the Tokugawa are gone. The feudal system of Japan, gone. The emperor is now head of state, and Japan is on the path to becoming a modern nation, which is going to influence its path going forward on the road to World War II. So that will conclude for this video. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, anything they would like to add, feel free to put it in the comment section below, and I'll be more than happy to go through them when I can. Like I said, I believe in the video before, I will not have a video this coming week. I am going to be on vacation, but I will still have some sort of a connection that I can try to respond to anything that comes through in terms of comment section or anything like that. So I'll still be able to respond, just won't have a video next week. So we'll look at our next video. The second week of August is when we'll look at that first, our next video coming out, which at this point, I think we'll go with the first Sino-Japanese War, and then we might take a break and cover something else before going a little further. So that will conclude for today. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, a good going into the weekend. And we'll up here in Ohio, we actually have a bit of a break from the hot weather. It was only 69 for a high today, so that's actually kind of a relief because we've been having 90-degree days up here. So, and I think it's only supposed to be the 70s the next few days. So hopefully it stays like that way. I think into the beginning part of next week, and then we might get back up in the heat again. So hopefully it stays cool. So hopefully everyone has a good, as we said, weekend, rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here next time for the next video over the first Sino-Japanese War.